I caught the guy mid-swing, chainsaw buzzing just inches from my cedar post when I shouted loud enough to make him freeze in place. His eyes met mine. I wasn't yelling out of fear. I was grinning like I just caught a raccoon in the cookie jar. "See this fence you're about to cut?" I said, pointing down the line. "That's not HOA land. That's the edge of my 600-acre ranch. And if you so much as scratch one post, I'll have you charged with destruction of private property on federally deeded land." The guy slowly backed away, eyes darting toward his truck, as if he suddenly realized he'd stepped into a legal minefield. And that's how this whole circus started, because Karen and her clipboard warriors thought a little picket fence was their hill to die on. It all began with a bright yellow envelope taped to my ranch gate flapping in the wind like it was trying to get my attention. On it bold block letters screamed HOA violation, and below it the words unauthorized fence construction, accompanied by a $10,000 proposed fine. The envelope was water-stained, like someone had tried to preserve its self-importance through a thunderstorm but failed. I stood there, boots muddy from the pasture, and looked at it for a long moment, thinking maybe this was some kind of joke. After all, my family had owned this land for 3 generations. That fence had stood for decades, long before Karen or her little suburban posse decided our rural stretch of heaven needed their rules and regulations. Inside the envelope was a letter typed in aggressive legalese. It accused me of violating community codes by erecting a structure on HOA-managed greenbelt property without approval. It also demanded I dismantle the fence within 10 days or face legal action, including liens and collection proceedings. The arrogance was so thick you could butter toast with it. I almost laughed. I didn't even live within their HOA. My ranch bordered their development, sure, but my land wasn't under their governance. In fact, the eastern boundary of their subdivision sat a solid 100 yards away from my property line. Or so I thought. That's when I met Karen. Not for the first time, but in the way a storm cloud meets a lightning rod. She rolled up in her pearl-white SUV with a giant HOA compliance sticker across the windshield, like she was on some self-appointed holy mission. She stepped out in heels far too clean for ranch dirt, clutching a clipboard like it was a judge's gavel, and announced to me and the cows grazing nearby that I was in violation of HOA Regulation 14B pertaining to exterior aesthetic encroachments. I asked her if she brought a map. She told me she didn't need one. The HOA had reviewed aerial images and determined my fence encroached on shared visual space. Visual space. I'd heard of some strange terms in my day, but that one took the cake. I tried to explain the fence was part of a larger perimeter marking the boundary of my 600-acre ranch, a line that had been verified by the county and recorded with the U.S. Geological Survey back when my grandfather built the original posts. She scoffed. I asked if she wanted to see the deed. She said, "We have our own document. You'll be fined accordingly." Then she turned around and strutted off like she just dropped the mic. Her 2 clipboard cronies followed her, one of them pausing to snap photos of my fence like it was a crime scene. At first I was amused. Then I got the second letter. This time it was a contractor notice. Apparently the HOA had approved the hiring of a demolition team to begin removal of my fence. They were scheduled for the following Tuesday. That was when the amusement evaporated. They weren't bluffing. They were really going to try to tear it down. I wasn't about to let that happen. Tuesday morning I set up a lawn chair just inside my property line, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. Sure enough, the contractor van showed up around 9 a.m. 2 guys stepped out wearing neon vests and hard hats, one of them dragging a gas-powered saw toward the fence like it was a tree waiting to be felled. I stood up, approached slowly and calmly, said, "I'd advise you to stop right there." One of them paused, unsure. The other kept walking. I added, "If you cross this line, you're trespassing. This land is federally deeded property. I have documentation on file with the county and copies right here. If you damage even one board, you'll be held liable personally and professionally. Still think it's worth the invoice?" That's when the guy with the saw looked down and finally saw what they missed. A small metal marker buried in concrete next to the fence post, stamped with official county boundary coordinate. He blinked, looked at his coworker, and muttered, "You didn't say this was private land." The other one shrugged and said, "We're just doing what the HOA told us." I smiled and hit record on my phone as I asked who at the HOA ordered this exactly, who put this on paper. The one holding the saw turned it off and whispered to his buddy, "Maybe we should call our boss." I said, "Good idea. Better yet, call your lawyer." They packed up quicker than a rattlesnake at a rodeo. I watched them drive off and sipped the rest of my coffee with satisfaction. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She was the kind that doubled down and turned up the heat even when the pan was on fire. The next morning my email inbox dinged. It was a mass HOA announcement stating a member of the community had unlawfully claimed Greenbelt property and that the board was seeking legal counsel. I replied, "All 600 acres are mine. Want the drone footage and county plat map, or should I just print them and bring them to your next meeting?" No response. Not even a thank you. Just silence. But Karen wouldn't stay quiet for long. And what she tried next would turn this little fence feud into a full-blown legal firestorm that nearly cost the HOA its entire community center. I was ready. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just picked a fight with the one guy in town who not only knew every inch of that land, but had mapped it himself. And if she wanted war over a fence, she was going to get one. Karen didn't just regroup. She came back swinging like she'd been personally insulted by the laws of geography. Less than 48 hours after the contractor fiasco, I received a certified letter from the HOA's so-called legal counsel. It was 4 pages of empty threats and misquoted statutes, demanding I not only remove the fence but also cease further encroachments and compensate the HOA for visual degradation of community value. I laughed out loud reading it. Visual degradation? From a fence that had been standing since my grandfather's time? If anything, their plastic yard flamingos were the real eyesore. But it was clear Karen wasn't backing off. She was escalating. And I had a feeling this wasn't about a fence anymore, it was about control. The type of control that people like her crave when they've been given just enough authority to feel dangerous. So I decided it was time to play my cards. I printed out the original land plat, the federal deed, and a 30-year-old boundary survey signed by the county engineer. Then I made a few calls, starting with the current county surveyor, an old friend of my dad's. He agreed to accompany me to the upcoming HOA board meeting. Said he could use a laugh. We arrived that Thursday evening at the clubhouse, which was already packed with lawn chair warriors and clipboard soldiers. Karen stood at the front like a queen presiding over her court, flipping through documents and pretending to look professional. When I walked in, the room felt noticeably quieter. Karen welcomed me with an insincere smile and immediately launched into her prepared speech, complete with a projector and low-resolution aerial images she pulled from the internet. Her big reveal was a blurry screenshot from Google Earth showing my fence and a red circle she'd drawn around it. "As you can see," she said dramatically, "this fence clearly crosses into what the HOA has designated as protected shared green space." I waited until she was done, then stepped forward and laid out the real boundary maps, scaled, stamped, signed, and certified. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the county surveyor speak. He calmly explained that the HOA's entire subdivision was carved from a portion of my family's land decades ago, with specific agreements and easements in place that had never been contested until now. He pointed out the property lines, traced them to their original coordinates, and then ended with a gentle but firm statement. "This fence," he said, tapping the map, "is 60 feet inside his property line. The HOA has no jurisdiction over it. Period." Karen's face turned the same shade as her cherry red lipstick. She fumbled with her papers, then blurted, "That can't be right. We paid for a new survey." That's when the surveyor gave her a look that could burn holes through drywall and said, "Unless that survey was done by a licensed professional and filed with the county, it's not just inaccurate, it's legally irrelevant." The room erupted into low murmurs. Karen's vice chair leaned over and whispered something to her. She waved him off like a queen dismissing a peasant. Then, clearly flustered, she claimed she had proof and tried to pull up an email from her contracted surveyor. But I was one step ahead. I'd already run the name she mentioned through the state licensing board. Turns out, her so-called surveyor was her cousin, a guy who had his license suspended 5 years ago for forging boundary reports on another HOA dispute. I shared this with the group by projecting the licensing board's public notice on the wall. It took less than 10 seconds to completely destroy her credibility. At this point, most of the room was on my side. Even the HOA treasurer looked like she regretted ever agreeing to attend. But Karen wasn't done. She shifted tactics. The next day, my property suddenly lost water pressure. At first I thought it was a burst pipe, but when I checked the junction where my private line met the shared water source that the HOA maintained for emergency access, I found the valve shut off and zip-tied. Not locked. Not sealed. Just zip-tied like a cheap prank. And stuck to it was another HOA notice taped in plastic. Water temporarily suspended pending compliance review. That's when I knew Karen had just made her biggest mistake yet. You see, while my ranch doesn't use HOA utilities, I had agreed years ago to let a minor backup line connect through their system for fire prevention in extreme droughts. That line ran through an easement, land still owned by me but permitted for emergency utilities. By shutting off that line without notification and tampering with equipment on my property, they had committed a clear violation of state utility code. I didn't call the HOA. I called the water district supervisor and forwarded them every detail, including the photos, the zip tie, and Karen's name as listed on the notice. Within a few hours, I received a call back. Their legal team was involved. So was the fire marshal, who wasn't happy to learn someone had cut off access to an emergency line without his department's clearance. By sunset, I was back at the junction with 3 utility trucks, 2 county inspectors, and one very confused HOA president who had apparently known nothing about the tampering. Karen wasn't there. She was unavailable. But the investigators weren't deterred. They documented everything, photographed the unauthorized shutoff, and issued a formal violation report against the HOA. I was advised to prepare a civil claim for damages. They even offered to help draft the paperwork. I accepted with a smile. That night, Karen posted a long-winded rant on the community board blaming me for harassing her volunteers and weaponizing paperwork against the HOA. She claimed she was just trying to beautify the neighborhood. But no one was buying it anymore. One neighbor posted a side-by-side image comparing my historic fence to Karen's inflatable flamingo army around her lawn ornaments. The post got over 100 laughing reactions and multiple comments like "I trust the fence guy. He has cows. Cows don't lie." Karen had declared war. But now she was retreating behind social media while the legal walls started closing in. I wasn't finished though. I had one more surprise. A quiet clause buried deep in the land deed that no one in the HOA had seen. And once they realized what it meant, they'd wish they'd never even looked in my direction. It didn't take long for Karen to realize she was losing control of the situation. The problem was, she didn't know how to back down. She only knew how to double down, and that's exactly what she did. A week after the waterline stunt blew up in her face, I received a legal-looking envelope with a county return address. For a moment I thought she might have finally dragged this mess into real court. But when I opened it, I nearly laughed out loud. It was a copy of a lawsuit, filed in small claims court, no less, by the HOA against me, citing fence encroachment, emotional distress, and environmental damage to community visual assets. It was as ridiculous as it was desperate. I'd seen kids write stronger arguments on schoolyard chalkboards. But I also knew this meant one thing. Karen had convinced the HOA board to officially back her crusade. And now they were staking the HOA's name and budget on a fight they couldn't possibly win. I immediately forwarded the suit to my attorney, who had been watching this debacle unfold with increasing amusement. He assured me it would be dismissed the moment we showed the actual land documents in court. But I wasn't satisfied with just winning. I wanted the HOA to feel the consequences of weaponizing bureaucracy. So I instructed my lawyer to file a counterclaim for damages: trespassing, interference with emergency utilities, and attempted destruction of private property. We attached the survey reports, the water district violation, and the contractor footage. My lawyer added a final punch: a formal injunction request to freeze all HOA discretionary spending until the matter was resolved. That included their landscaping contracts, event budget, and yes, even Karen's newly approved HOA golf cart purchase, which was apparently part of a neighborhood patrol initiative. The injunction hit them like a sledgehammer. Suddenly, the HOA couldn't pay their vendors, couldn't approve petty fines, and couldn't even print newsletters without getting court clearance. I knew it was only a matter of time before the other board members would start turning on Karen. And right on schedule, one of them, a guy named Tom, who had been suspiciously quiet through all of this, reached out privately. He said he didn't realize how deep Karen had gone with her personal vendetta, and that most of the board had relied on her version of events without checking the actual records. I told him that wasn't my problem. But I also told him that if the board publicly admitted fault and dropped the claims, I might be willing to negotiate. Instead of accepting the olive branch, Karen tried another stunt. A few nights later, just past midnight, I noticed motion lights go off by the far side of my fence line. At first, I figured it might be deer or one of the neighbors' wandering dogs. But when I checked the live feed from the security cameras I'd installed after the contractor incident, I saw something entirely different. A teenage girl in a hoodie was spraying something on my fence with a can. She was writing words, sloppy, uneven, and fast. She didn't notice the cameras. But I noticed the SUV parked across the road. The same SUV I'd seen parked outside Karen's home more than once. The next morning, I reviewed the footage and confirmed what I suspected. The girl was Karen's daughter. She had spray-painted HOA land across 3 fence panels and added a few symbols that looked like an angry attempt at branding territory. I didn't bother calling the HOA this time. I went straight to the police. With the footage in hand, it didn't take much to file a report. The responding officer recognized Karen's name immediately. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had complained about her overstepping. Within a day, her daughter was cited for defacement and trespassing. When the news reached the board, things began to crack. Karen showed up to the next emergency board meeting with dark glasses and a red face. She tried to spin the story, claiming her daughter was protesting injustice and standing up for community integrity. But no one was buying it. The treasurer openly called her behavior reckless. The secretary demanded she step down. Karen responded with a tearful speech about how hard she'd worked to protect the neighborhood from people like me, outsiders who disrespected HOA culture. That was her mistake. I wasn't an outsider. I was a third-generation landowner who'd lived in that valley since before any of their homes were built. Her entire narrative collapsed in real time. But the real twist hadn't arrived yet. See, while all of this was playing out, I'd been digging through old family files, documents my grandfather had kept in a locked cabinet, mostly forgotten since his passing. That's when I stumbled across a legal agreement dated back to when he sold a portion of the ranch land to the county. In it was a clause so obscure it had probably never been read by anyone in the HOA or even the county in decades. It stated that if any governing body or third-party entity attempted to challenge the boundary lines of the remaining ranch property, the seller, the original landowner, retained legal authority to initiate reversion proceedings. In short, if anyone disputed the boundary, the land they had received from the original agreement could be reclaimed. At first I thought it couldn't be real, but I took it to a land use attorney who specialized in old property clauses. After some digging and a very excited phone call, he confirmed that the clause still held legal weight. Not only that, but the HOA's challenge, formalized through their lawsuit, triggered the condition for review. If I pushed it, I could legally reclaim a small but important chunk of their land, a 12-acre patch where their clubhouse, tennis court, and community garden now sat. I didn't rush it. I waited. Let them squirm. Then I had my attorney send one final letter, not to Karen, but to the entire HOA board. It included the clause, the county records, and a very clear warning: drop the case, pay for the damages, and accept full liability, or prepare for a lawsuit that could revoke your claim to some of the most valuable land in your neighborhood. The letter ended with a note: I would be seeking court costs and filing fees on top of the reversion if they didn't settle. The board went silent. Karen didn't. She went ballistic. She posted on community forums, called me a liar, and claimed I was fabricating ancient documents to steal HOA property. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The board scheduled a vote behind closed doors to determine whether to move forward with the suit or accept the terms of my offer. When they came out, the president read the result: unanimous in favor of settlement. Karen's face twisted in disbelief as she looked around and realized no one backed her anymore. They were done fighting her war. And she was finally, painfully alone. The silence after that vote was louder than any shouting match. Karen stood there blinking like she'd just woken up in a foreign country where no one spoke her language. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The HOA president thanked everyone for attending, quickly closed the meeting, and the board members filed out one by one without looking in her direction. She tried to follow them, but even the treasurer, a woman who used to back Karen on every issue, shook her head and walked away without a word. I stood near the door, watching her unravel. Her entire empire of petty fines, bogus surveys, and control had collapsed in under 10 minutes. And she knew it wasn't over yet. She hadn't just lost a vote. She had awakened a consequence that had been buried under decades of dust and legal jargon, and now it was marching right back to her doorstep. The next morning, my attorney and I met with the county's land office to initiate the first steps in reasserting the reversion clause. The clerk's eyes widened when she saw the documents. She called over her supervisor, who brought over a senior attorney from the county legal team. By noon, there were 4 officials in the room poring over the original agreement like it was a lost scroll. The key clause was clear and simple. Any challenge to the established boundary would trigger a legal review, and if found invalid, the granted land would revert to the seller's heir. And since the HOA's lawsuit explicitly challenged the line, I had every right to begin proceedings. The land in question was no small patch. It included the HOA's prized community center, their tennis courts, and a children's park, all built on land my grandfather had originally given to the county in good faith. Karen's challenge had just undone decades of peaceful coexistence, all because she couldn't stand the sight of a fence. The legal process would take time, but the direction was set. The HOA would now be dealing with a land use investigation, and possibly face losing their centerpiece property to the very man they tried to fine. They'd triggered the legal equivalent of a landmine. Karen didn't show up to the next board meeting. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents were furious, not at me, but at the board for allowing one person's obsession to jeopardize their whole community. Others quietly approached me offering apologies and shaking my hand. One guy named Roger, who had kept to himself until now, told me that Karen had tried to fine him for planting tomatoes in his backyard. Another woman revealed that Karen once threatened her with eviction over a decorative flag that wasn't on the HOA-approved list. Now that the spell was broken, the floodgates opened. Everyone had a story. I wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake. I wanted closure. I had no intention of bulldozing a community center or turning a playground into a pasture. So I made my move. Through my lawyer, I offered the HOA 2 options. The first was simple and legal. I reclaim the 12-acre plot as per the deed, fence it off, and the HOA loses access to all of it. No clubhouse, no courts, no garden. The second option was more generous. I allow the HOA to remain on the land, but under a 99-year lease. That lease would have new terms: First, no fines could be issued to non-HOA members. Second, any complaint or enforcement action involving bordering properties required board-wide approval. Third, Karen would be permanently barred from holding any position within the HOA. Lastly, the HOA would pay a symbolic rent of $1 a year to my ranch in acknowledgement of the lease. They had 72 hours to decide. The backlash among the residents was immediate and loud. Nobody wanted to lose the community center, especially over something as absurd as a boundary dispute that never should have happened. The board called an emergency vote and this time invited residents to attend. It was the largest turnout they'd ever seen. People filled the hall, spilling into the hallway, holding copies of the lease proposal and whispering urgently to one another. The vote took less than 5 minutes. Unanimous approval. Karen was officially removed from all HOA leadership. The lease was signed, and a new era began, one not ruled by the sound of a clipboard slapping against a car hood. I attended the next community meeting not as a defendant, not even as a threat, but as a neighbor. The new HOA president, a retired Air Force captain named Linda, welcomed me publicly and thanked me for giving them a second chance. The crowd clapped. Even kids cheered. It was surreal. Just a month ago, I was the villain on their bulletin board. Now I was something between the hero of the valley and the reluctant sheriff who had settled an old Western standoff with maps instead of bullets. But I wasn't done. I had one more thing to install. With the fence now solidly recognized as mine and the feud legally settled, I commissioned a custom metal sign from a local fabricator. I didn't want anything aggressive or boastful, just something that marked history with a touch of humor. When the sign was ready, I invited a few folks from the neighborhood to join me for its installation. A couple families brought lawn chairs. One guy even brought a grill. It turned into a small celebration. The sign went up right next to the corner post where the contractor once tried to cut through. It read Ranch Boundary Established 1952. In case of confusion, consult a map or call your lawyer. People laughed and took pictures. It became a kind of inside joke for the community, a permanent reminder of how one woman's obsession nearly caused a meltdown and how old deeds still matter in a world of digital shortcuts and self-appointed authority. Karen didn't attend the gathering, of course. She'd vanished from public view. Rumor had it she tried joining the HOA board in a neighboring community. They turned her down before she even finished filling out the application. Apparently, someone on their board had read the news coverage about the fence fiasco. Yes, it made the news. A local reporter who specialized in real estate disputes wrote a front-page piece titled "The Fence That Beat the HOA." There was even a cartoon drawing of Karen's SUV stuck in a mud puddle next to a very defiant-looking fence. For me, things returned to normal. Quiet mornings, clear skies, and 600 acres of ranchland exactly where it had always been. The fence stood unbothered, the cows grazed freely, and the only drama came from the occasional rooster deciding it was his turn to be king of the yard. But I knew that fence had become more than just a border. It was a symbol of standing your ground, not just physically but legally, ethically, and stubbornly when needed. And I was damn proud of it. The months that followed were quieter than anything I'd experienced in years, which was saying something considering I lived on a 600-acre ranch surrounded by cattle and coyotes. With the lease signed, the lawsuits dropped, and Karen dethroned, peace settled over the valley like the first snow in winter, silent, pure, and strangely refreshing. The fence stood untouched. Not a single board missing, no new threats in my mailbox, no late-night contractor visit. For the first time in a long time, I could walk the perimeter of my property with a cup of coffee in hand and not glance over my shoulder expecting to see some clipboard-wielding volunteer lurking in the tree line. The HOA, under its new leadership, had become surprisingly neighborly. Linda, the retired Air Force captain who had taken over, was a woman of order and fairness. She came by the ranch personally to walk the border lines and make sure everything aligned with the lease. When she saw the monument sign I'd put up, She burst into laughter and asked if she could take a photo for the HOA newsletter. I gave her permission, and the next issue had the picture right on the cover with the caption, "Know your borders, love your neighbors." It was the first time the HOA newsletter hadn't included a single fine, threat, or passive-aggressive policy reminder. Residents said it was the best one they'd ever received. The transformation didn't stop there. Without Karen constantly stirring up conflict, the community began to find its rhythm again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were now organizing cleanup drives, garden swaps, and even summer BBQs. I was invited to the first one held at the community center I technically now owned. I went partly out of curiosity and partly because it felt like the final step in moving past the chaos. I showed up with a tray of ribs and a cooler of soda, and to my surprise, was treated like a guest of honor. A few folks sheepishly approached to apologize for believing Karen's claims, and I accepted with no hard feelings. In truth, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about resetting the tone for the entire neighborhood. Someone had even hung a cartoon caricature of Karen inside the community hall, tucked into a corner where the kids painted their handprints on the wall. In it, she was shown chasing a fence on wheels while wearing a crown made of surveyor tape. It wasn't mean-spirited, just silly, and somehow perfectly captured the absurdity of the whole saga. I didn't ask who drew it, but I had a good guess. Roger, the tomato gardener, had a talent with pens and a wicked sense of humor. As for Karen, she remained a ghost. Her house was still there, the shrubs neatly trimmed, the driveway swept, but she no longer attended meetings, social events, or even HOA voting sessions. Rumor had it she was looking to sell and move elsewhere, possibly to a community where she could start fresh, or maybe just find a new set of people to boss around. I heard whispers that she tried to spin her version of events to an HOA in another town, but her reputation had already arrived before she did. The story had made the rounds online, and thanks to that newspaper article, a surprising number of HOA boards were aware of the fence lady who triggered a land reversion clause with a bad Google Earth screenshot. I didn't revel in her fall, but I also didn't mourn it. People like Karen thrived on unchecked power. When you strip that away, what's left is often just noise. And once that noise fades, the community can finally hear itself think again. The funny part was how many people started asking me about property law. Not just neighbors. Folks from other towns, relatives, even strangers online who found the article. I had calls from people wanting to know how to interpret deeds, survey land, and protect themselves from similar conflicts. I never planned on becoming some kind of grassroots property rights consultant, but it seemed like my fence had sparked something far bigger than a neighborhood squabble. It had become a lesson, a symbol, about standing firm in the face of manufactured authority. One weekend, a father and son drove 3 hours from out of town just to see the fence. I found them near the corner post where it all started, taking selfies and reading the sign like it was a historical marker. When I asked what brought them all this way, the dad said, "We just wanted to show my boy what it looks like when someone doesn't back down." That stuck with me longer than anything else. It reminded me of my grandfather, the man who first set those markers in the dirt, not knowing that decades later, his land and his legacy would be tested and ultimately protected by that very line he drew. I added a second sign beneath the first one a few days later. Smaller, quieter, but more personal. It read, "This land has been stood on, fought for, and held with pride. Respect it, and it will respect you back." It wasn't for show. It was for every person who passed through, whether on foot, by truck, or just wandering by with questions. Eventually, the county finalized the lease agreement into public record. The story ran its course in the media, the meetings quieted down, and life returned to its normal tempo. The cows still wandered too close to the fence sometimes, the roosters still challenged each other at dawn, and the weather still didn't care what any HOA had to say. But something had shifted. Not just in my land or their policies, but in the atmosphere between everyone who lived there. Boundaries aren't just lines on a map. They're promises. My fence marked more than territory. It marked history, family, principle, and patience. It stood through storms, lawsuits, and nighttime vandalism. And it was still standing. Stronger now, in fact, than ever before. I often find myself standing by that fence around sunset, hat tipped back, watching the horizon turn orange and gold. Sometimes a neighbor drives by and waves. Sometimes they stop and chat for a while. We don't talk about Karen much anymore. Not because we've forgotten, but because we've moved on. The fence, however, remembers everything. And that's exactly how it should be.